James Capehart, the independent researcher from Indiana. Hi, Jim. Jim will give a talk on Étienne Gilson and 3 stages of his Christian philosophy. So I will display Jim's talk right now, and we will have a discussion after it.
Hello. I would like to present the thought of Étienne Gilson on Christian philosophy in 3 stages in this upcoming presentation. The first stage, I'm calling its gestational stage, from the 1920s through the early 1930s, at the end of the first Christian philosophy debate. Its second stage, I'm calling its birth and infancy, from the 1930s through the 1940s, early 1950s. And the third ending stage, its state of maturity, from the late 1950s through the 1960s. Thus, I will demarcate 3 main stages of the development of Gilson's doctrine on Christian philosophy through an examination of some of Gilson's most important works of this 50-year period, especially as regards his thought on the relationship of Christianity and philosophy. Also, throughout those 3 stages, I will show that Gilson's Christian philosophy should be conceived as existing in 2 possible modes. That's a key theme to this whole presentation. One mode, Christian philosophy as ancilla theologiae, that Christian philosophy as a philosophical component within theology, and Christian philosophy as amicus theologiae, employed outside of theology proper, but still very much influenced by Christian revelation and grace. Also, I'd like to show Gilson's influence on St. John Paul II's treatment of Christian philosophy in Fides et Ratio, and conclude with some reflections on how Christian philosophy, I suggest, should move forward. Let's go to his first stage, what I'm calling Christian philosophy in gestation. The earliest work that I'm treating of is the philosophy of St. Bonaventure of 1924. He does not define Christian philosophy in that work, but there is one place where he gives 4 key characteristics of it, trying to show how are Thomas and Bonaventure similar despite their differences. And that similarity is in that they are Christian philosophers. Well, what are those key characteristics? He says, as against pantheism, both of them teach creation from nothing and maintain that the gulf is infinite between absolute being and contingent. So the notion of creation influences their philosophy. Okay. Against ontologism, both deny explicitly that God can be seen at all by the human mind in this life, and a fortiori, they deny that habitual knowledge of God, which ontologism attributes to us. Okay, well, Christian revelation has influenced human knowing, human philosophical knowing about God, how we know about God. Even if there are differences in their doctrines, there's much great similarity. As against fideism, they both set the most thorough effort of the intellect to prove the existence of God and interpret the data of faith. Yes, Christian philosophers, there is an area of preambles, that is, things that may be revealed, but which are capable of rational development, rational investigation, and possibly rational proof. As against rationalism, both coordinate the effort of the intellect with the act of faith and maintain the beneficent influence of the habit of faith upon the operations of the intellect. For the Christian philosopher, faith and grace ennoble the Christian, such that he might philosophize all the better. All right, let's move on to Les Thomisme, 3rd edition of 1927. Here he gives what I believe to be the first definition in print that for him of Christian philosophy. And he says, referring to St. Thomas's Christian philosophy, he says, we mean by this phrase, a philosophy which intends to be a rational interpretation of data, but which considers as the essential element of these data the religious faith, the object of which is defined by Christian revelation. It's philosophical. It is a rational interpretation of data. Well, how is it Christian? Christianity suggests starting points for rational investigation, starting points which may or may not, that we might or may not have ever come to without Christian suggestion. But we're not talking about mysteries or articles of faith. Again, this is that area of preambles, of investigating preambles, of maybe coming to prove preambles. All right, let's move on. Interesting point. Christian philosophy of Gilson in this first stage is much more Bonaventurian, Augustinian, Thomistic. It's broad. Gilson is looking for commonalities in these great theologians and philosophers. I suggest that in the next stage there is more of a Thomistic turn, but here at the close of this first stage, at his 1931 The Notion of Christian Philosophy, he defines Christian philosophy in a highly Augustinian way. He says, what is peculiar to the Christian is being convinced of the rational fertility of his faith, being sure that this fertility is inexhaustible. We pay attention. That is the true meaning of St. Augustine's Credo ut intelligam and St. Anselm's Fides quaerens intellectum, a Christian's effort to draw some of reason's knowledge from faith and revelation. That is why these two formulas are the true definition of Christian philosophy. Credo ut intelligam, I believe that I may understand, and Fides quaerens intellectum, the faith-seeking understanding. The Christian philosophy at the close of this first stage is that kind of rational, seeking a rational understanding of the faith. What can be rationally understood of the faith? Again, this points to the preambles. He is not saying trying to demonstrate articles of faith. Okay, those preambles, they have been revealed, but they are at least de jure capable of being known by reason, that God exists, the immortality of the soul. Oh, the Ten Commandments. Okay, he is for this understanding of these have been revealed. Hey, now they're a starting point. Well, what can we do to come to understand them better? Can we ground them philosophically? That's very much Christian philosophy for Gilson. Let's go on to his second stage, beginning with the spirit of medieval philosophy, and his landmark definition there. He says, thus I call Christian every philosophy which, although keeping the two orders formally distinct, nevertheless consider the Christian revelation as an indispensable auxiliary to reason. Okay, so Christianity and philosophy, or Christian revelation, Christian theology, and philosophy are distinct formally, but, and then he goes on, for whoever understands it thus, the concept does not correspond to any simple essence susceptible of abstract definition, but corresponds much rather to a concrete historical reality as something calling for a description. Okay, he's heavily influenced by Maritain in this, is that the idea that Christian philosophy doesn't exist in the formal order, but in the order of exercise within the individual doing philosophy. His Christianity, Christian faith, and the life of grace, Christian culture, nourish this individual, nourish his intellect and his will to better philosophize. Okay, that's why it exists as a concrete reality. Okay, let's move on to his Christianity and Philosophy of 1936, where he's going to go on to emphasize this relationship of Christianity to philosophy to be like that of grace and nature. So it's not just, again, following Maritain. He's heavily influenced on Maritain on this, in my opinion. Maritain, in his Christian philosophy, speaks of the objective influence of Christianity upon philosophy, but the subjective influence. Gilson seems to embrace that and to get that. So he says, faith in the divine word brings this grace to us, and to accept it is to philosophize as a Christian. To forget what good remains in nature is fatal to Catholicism, but to forget what nature has suffered and the remedies which its weakness calls for would be none the less fatal to it. The truly Catholic attitude in the face of the philosophical tasks which confront us consists, therefore, in never despairing of reason, but in carefully availing ourselves of the supernatural aids that God offers the reason in order to permit the same to succeed in its enterprises. That's Christian philosophy, not by definition, but by act. What's going on? The Christian life is ennobling reason, post-lapsarian reason, to philosophize all the better. It's a subjective influence of Christianity upon the development of this philosophy. Okay, let's go on. That was 1936, and I've got to jump way ahead to 1951. Okay, so far we haven't really had, we've had Christian philosophy presumably as a handmaid of theology. We've had Christian philosophy, it seems, where he emphasizes, we're doing philosophy as philosophers. Here, he talks about scholastic philosophy, doesn't it? Christian philosophy. The scholastic philosophy returning to theology. Okay. Where he says, oops, I'm sorry, lost my spot. To restore it to itself, let us listen to the counsel of history. Scholastic philosophy must return to theology. Okay. The philosophy we call scholastic is not distinguished from other philosophies by its essence. It is rather distinguished from them as the best way of philosophizing. He is saying that best way of philosophizing is done like the scholastic theologians. Okay, he says, that is indeed how the encyclical Aeterni Patris has described scholastic philosophy, and with perfect reason. He who joins the study of philosophy with obedience to Christian faith, he philosophizes best, quoting from Aeterni Patris 9. To philosophize otherwise is assuredly to philosophize, but it is to philosophize less well. At any rate, it is no longer to philosophize as did the scholastics. That famous essay makes one think that Gilson basically said, no, I'm disagreeing with what I said before. Christian philosophy must be done in one mode as within theology. He does highly emphasize this. Is that true? Is there no way that a philosopher, embracing Christian revelation and its influence, but doing philosophy as such outside of theology, can't that be Christian philosophy? Isn't that Christian philosophy? And there are further texts here that I think suggest yes, and that Gilson would agree. We'll go to his 1957, What is Christian Philosophy? Here he defines Christian philosophy. Quote, okay, clearly what Leo, talking about Aeterni Patris, paragraph 9 again, clearly what Leo calls Christian philosophy cannot be reduced to the content of any single philosophy. It is neither a system nor even a doctrine. Rather, it is a way of philosophizing, namely the attitude of those who, to the study of philosophy, unite obedience to Christian faith. This philosophical method or attitude, Philosophandi Institutum, is Christian philosophy itself. Let that sink in. Christian philosophy is a way of philosophizing which unites the study of philosophy to obedience to Christian faith. That can be done in either mode, within theology or outside of theology as such. Let's go on to his definition of Christian philosophy in 1962 in his philosophical memoir, The Philosopher in Theology. He says, speaking of Christian philosophy, he says, Christian philosophy transcends the distinction of scholastic philosophy and scholastic theology. It designates the use the Christian makes of the philosophical reason when, in either one of these two disciplines, he associates religious faith and philosophical reflection. That, my friends, is a Christian philosophy in either mode, either in theology by a philosophizing theologian or by a philosophizing philosopher outside of theology, but very much still keen to that friendship with Christian revelation, suggesting starting points for investigation, embracing the life of grace and Christian culture to ennoble his reason and to even better philosophize. Let's go to Fides et Ratio very quickly to give John Paul II gives a definition of Christian philosophy. He speaks of a second stance adopted by philosophy is often designated as Christian philosophy. In itself, the term is valid, but it should not be misunderstood. It in no way intends to suggest that there is an official philosophy of the church, since the faith as such is not a philosophy. The term seeks rather to indicate a Christian way of philosophizing, a philosophical speculation conceived in dynamic union with the faith. This is as Gilsonian gets. I mean, that is heavily influenced by our last three texts of Gilson. So what would I say here at the closing of this presentation that I think with Gilson and Jean-Paul II in Fides et Ratio, I think we have a map moving forward for Christian philosophy. I think we very much, the philosophizing Christian theologian has a path forward for doing Christian philosophy as Ancilla Theologiae, but the Christian philosopher as philosopher also should embrace that influence of faith and revelation to move philosophy forward, to also be a better handmaid for theology, and also be a better tool for leading
Thank you very much. That was James Capehart from Indiana. Thank you, James. And now, do we have any questions on site? If not, let's move to the questions from WebEx participants. Just please unmute yourself, ask the question, and mute yourself again. Thanks. Go on, huh?
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite interesting. The truth is that I worked on Gilson quite a bit, especially on his conception of Christian philosophy, because I think that nowadays it's heavily undermined and overlooked. And the very question of what Christian philosophy is almost non-existent. And Gilson did give quite a bit of effort to define it. The point on which I disagree with your presentation is that I wouldn't speak about relation between philosophy or doing Christian philosophy within theology in Gilson at all. He doesn't speak about theology that much, unless he speaks about Philosophia Ancilla Theologia. He speaks about faith. There is quite important, of course, you know what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about his essay on the spirit of Christian philosophy. Just a minute. And he says very clearly, just a minute, there is no such thing as a Christian reason, but there may very well be a Christian exercise of reason. And then he tries to explain what this exercise of reason could be. And after all, it is exercise of reason in the light of faith. And this light of faith transforms philosophy. This light of faith is the criterion, the ultimate criterion of truth for a Christian philosopher. It's not a theology. It's not a doctrine. It's even not the content of revelation. it is the light of faith. And then Gilson explains it in this way. He actually continues the very Gregory of Nyssa explanation of what is to be a Christian thinker. He quotes Gregory. It is exactly about speaking in the light of faith, exercising reason, and also he speaks in the same terms when he presents the history of Justin, and his talk with Jewish philosopher. So again, it's not about theology. It's about faith. Thank you very much.
Here we go. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Thank you, Anna. Oh, that's an excellent comment. And I would say, I think that you're right, that it is about faith. Again, that I think that emphasizes the Maritanian influence that's not highlighted enough on Gilson, that Christian philosophy is in the order of exercise. It's the person, the philosopher, influenced by faith, by grace, by this Christian influence in his life, in his or her life. I think when I speak of these two modes, this is treating Gilson historically, and the fact that he was a historian of philosophy. You find him often treating, well, where's Christian philosophy found historically? In the works of Christian theologians. So in that respect, it's not incorrect to find it historically, a philosophical component found in these theologians. But I think there's a shift in his thought from the fact of Christian philosophy, as I call it, to the act of Christian philosophy. And I think you are right. I think the act of Christian philosophy is that act, that philosophical act done under the beneficent influence of faith. Nevertheless, he would maintain you're still philosophizing. You're still obeying the rules of philosophy. You're not reasoning from properly revealed premises. You may be attempting to prove revealed things in a philosophical manner. That's a suggestion of starting points. But I think you're right. But I think that's the Gilson emphasis of philosophy, Christian philosophy as act, which that I think that emphasis starts to take over in his works from the 1930s forward. I'm not sure what year the essay you quoted, but that's a growing emphasis of Gilson from his second stage on. That would be, but I agree with you.
It is quite late of his essays. It is one of the latest, and it's already after all of his discussion about whether such kind of thing as Christian philosophy did exist at all. It's all after his discussions, and he tried to define what really discerns Christian philosophy as philosophy. And of course, it's not the content. Many times I'm reading books about so-called Christian philosophy, and a part of this book is, for instance, on Mariology. And I'm sorry to say it, it's not a part of philosophy whatsoever. And it's not the content of revelation. It is the formal aspect of exercising your reason. And the formal aspect of exercising your reason, that you are doing something, you reflect on something, you are doing your argumentation within, in light of faith. Thank you.
Okay, we have two questions more. The first is from John Hittinger, and the latter is from YouTube. John, would you like to ask?
Yes, just briefly, in light of Anna's remark, in Intelligence in Service to Christ the King, he does say explicitly, theology is essential to philosophy. Now, I don't think that contradicts what you're saying, Anna, but I think it does qualify it. And maybe Jim would want to comment on this. In that essay, he says the Christian philosopher is not doing philosophy as an end in itself. He does respect its own structures and exercise, but he always will orient it towards the transcendent. That's the direction that philosophy goes. I mean, Plato and Aristotle are already doing that, but he does think that theology is necessary for the Christian philosopher, in addition to faith, to have a mind that is formed intellectually according to the truths of faith, not just held in the mode of faith, but actually through theology. I wonder if both of you would want to comment on that strong statement of Gilson.
Maybe I will start. I think that he's obviously right, but in what sense, connecting with what I said before, theology gives to philosophy, it is a source of potential problems to work on. It's like a muse for philosophy. Christian theology gives many additional problems, philosophical problems, that didn't exist before Christianity as such. The very question of incarnation actually raised the most basic for us nowadays problem of individual subject. What it is, how it could be defined, because before that there was no such subject for philosophy to discuss as Jesus Christ, who in itself is an ontological, logical oxymoron. And there are a lot of things like creation and other things. It is a source of influence in a new problem. So in the wet way, absolutely. It's my part of answering your question. So please, James, continue if you...
Oops. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. See, I think we're in much greater agreement than I think it might appear at first, because I mean, everything Anna just said, I'm in agreement with, making that last point. And Gilson emphasized this. That's that idea of Christianity suggesting starting points. I mean, that Joseph Owens used the term starting points, but Joseph Owens used the term to describe what he read of Gilson. That being said, I hope I'm answering Dr. Hittinger's question. With that intelligence in service to Christ the King, this is that you're starting to see Gilson seeing and saying Christian philosophy, properly speaking, is at the service of theology. He's definitely that's a strong emphasis. There are lots of texts where he emphasizes that that I actually skipped over for lack of time. But Gilson, the historian, is trying to make it. There are philosophers, but he's trying to make as the historian, he's trying to make a case for describing what is this philosophy. We have Christian theologians, St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, St. Augustine. They're theologians. We know them to be theologians. Is there any philosophy present in their works? If so, what is the basis of calling it philosophical? And he comes to find out, well, whatever is philosophical in their work is at the service of their theology. I mean, and that's why he calls for that return to theology. But I do think that's Gilson the historian speaking. But Gilson the philosopher, I think he sees the proper way of doing philosophy as a Christian, however you're going to do it, whether you're a theologian who's got to philosophize within theology or whether you're an academic philosopher, is to embrace that influence of faith in your philosophizing. I mean, regardless, I think that's the key. Okay, Anna, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
May I add something? When we're speaking about those elements that could be found in fathers of church, scholastic thinkers, etc., what is interesting is not how their stricter philosophical account that we took from Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonists, Stoics. I'm sorry to say it, but Thomas Aquinas, as an Aristotelian scholar, was very weak. He is nothing in comparison to Alexander of Aphrodisia. He wasn't that brilliant as Aristotle, as interpreter of Aristotle. They're much greater than him, and you can use other example, not Thomas Aquinas, but all of them brought something specific into philosophy that didn't exist before, because of their faith and because they needed to work on notions, conceptions, etc., philosophical notions, philosophical conceptions, for the sake of theological problems. And was theological problems there of Christian nature? So the most original and important elements of thoughts of Augustine, St. Thomas, St. Albert, and others are exactly things that were made for and because and for the sake of theology and in the light of faith.
We are in complete and total agreement.